Hi, and welcome to Axelbank Reports History and Today, conversations with America's top nonfiction authors and why their books matter right now. I'm Evan Axelbank, and today we're going to speak with the very beautifully named Evan Friss, the author of The Bookshop, A History of the American Bookstore. This is his third book, and he is a professor of history at James Madison University. Evan, thanks so much for being here and for being the first guest named Evan.
Thank you, Evan. I think you're the first interviewer I've had who shares my name.
There we go. Before we jump into it, I want to invite listeners to our Patreon page to ask for your support in keeping this show going. Go to patreon.com/AxelbankHistory. We will donate part of your contributions to a charity for children's literacy. There probably isn't anyone in America who would say they don't absolutely love bookstores. At least that's what they say. They wouldn't say they would say, of course, that they'd love to spend all day in a bookstore. People always say that, and the feeling that I get when I walk into a bookstore is one of unlimited curiosity. Which books have I read in here? Which haven't I read? Which would I never read? Are any of my podcast guest books in here? Do I have time to bring my own book and just sit here? Usually the answer is no, but of course I wish it was always yes. Unfortunately, Evan says that space is endangered, and not just by the cliche that you can just buy whatever you want online now. But somehow bookstores have survived despite TV, video games, libraries, and our short attention spans. In fact, a Barnes and Noble near me in Tampa just closed only to reopen a mile or two away. So, Evan, how did Ben Franklin create the first American bookstore?
Well, there's a lot to unpack there, but starting
Yeah,
with Franklin,
I nailed you right from the beginning there.
no, those are all excellent points. So, Ben Franklin was one of the first American booksellers. Determining who the very first is actually pretty complicated and largely depends on what we think of as a bookseller. So he and even some of the people who beat him to the punch who sold books were also printers. And many of the first printers producing material, often that was sort of generated in London, they would print reprints of it here and would sell some copies. And so they were booksellers, but their spaces really weren't bookstores, at least as we would think of them today. Spaces that are filled with mostly books and have this kind of quiet, browsing friendly atmosphere. So Franklin's shop was a kind of transition, and he was, as most of your listeners surely know, had wide ranging interests and had a lot of connections in terms of politics and science and literature. And so he was a printer first and foremost, and a huge reader. And he started building a collection of materials to sell. And by the time that his bookstore was sort of emerging, there really wasn't much competition. And so his little shop in Philadelphia was a post office, was a printing center, but was also a bookstore and became the leading bookstore in colonial America.
What does it say about life back then, that it was like a clearinghouse for all these different things, and books could be sold amongst the everyday things that people would purchase?
So in some part, it was because there wasn't much of a market. So even though people going into bookselling today might be seen as crazy for the financial prospect, there were different challenges back then. Much of the colonial population was illiterate. Of course, enslaved people were prohibited from learning how to read in many states, and even free white people, many of them were not educated, and books were very rare and expensive for the most part. So there wasn't a huge market. It was cumbersome to make. It was a very laborious process. And how did you find your market? So in some ways, it started out of a necessity that you could sell books so long as you were also selling dry goods, other kinds of materials, paper. And Ben Franklin was a wholesaler. of books as well as printing materials. So he had a very robust business, and the books were an important piece of it. But his store wouldn't have existed just as a solitary bookstore.
And he said that he took every, I'm paraphrasing, but he took every spare dollar he had and put them towards books.
Yeah, he was a huge reader himself, and he started by being a printer because his brother was a printer up in Boston. But the appeal to him was always having access to literature. So he was a huge reader, and he went to London, came back, and basically saw that there was this lacuna, that there weren't places selling the kinds of material that he and his friends wanted to read. So he was going to fill that void.
We're going to fill in the next 250 years at some point during the show, but I want to jump ahead right now. What do we know about statistics right now? How many bookstores are there? And how does that compare to when they were at their peak?
So this is actually also and not to get too much in the weeds, although people do like statistics. Defining what a bookstore is difficult even in today's world. And the two metrics most people use are either numbers from the American Booksellers Association, which is the large trade group that most indie bookstores belong to and has their own count of members and number stores. But a probably more accurate number is produced by the United States Census, which keeps track of these business statistics on a regular basis. And the census defines a bookstore as any retail space in which at least 50% of their revenue is derived from books. So using that number or some best combination of what I can tell, the number of bookstores we have today is a small fraction of what there was 30 or 40 years ago. I write the exact number in my book, but I can't remember off the top of my head. But a precipitous decline in the 90s and more so in the early 2000s and 2010s. In recent years, the number of bookstores has stabilized, or depending on what numbers you look at, has possibly even slightly increased. Um, so there's in the short term perspective, there's some optimism that bookstores seem to be gaining steam. Barnes and Nobles, as you referenced in your local area, are reopening in actually greater numbers than they've done in decades. So there's 60 new Barnes and Noble outlets opening this calendar year after many years of retrenchment.
I mean, that's unbelievable.
Yeah, it's remarkable. So yeah, and I don't want to be too negative and pessimistic. That's something really to celebrate. But if you expand the time window and look back over the course of decades, then the chart looks much uglier.
In your view, what is critical about a bookstore? Is it the quantity of books? Is it how they're organized? Is it the air conditioning? Your book references the smell. We all know that kind of gluey paper. I don't know if it's paper we're smelling. It's probably more glue we're smelling. Um, is it the sound in the room? Is it the booksellers, the people who work there themselves? What do we go there for?
Yeah, I think it's all of the above, and there's no magic formula. One of the favorite bits I came across in my book was finding a bookstore in Chicago that was designed by Frank Lloyd Wright, and it just sort of it gave me this kind of thought experiment of what, with the greatest architects in the world, I don't know, today, Frank Gehry or I.M. Pei, if these people were designing little bookstores instead of grand museums, what would they look like? And in the case of Frank Lloyd Wright, it was a disaster. His bookstore, at least in my opinion, was bizarre and uncomfortable looking and didn't have the right feel. So there's an imperfect formula. There's no secret to success, but I would say it's, three basic elements. The first is the selection. That is the books themselves matter and give the browser a sense of what kind of bookstore it is and what kind of taste the owner or book buyer has. It's the people working there, and there's an expectation, at least in today's bookstores, that our booksellers are both knowledgeable voracious readers, but also people who can help us and lead us to discover the right kind of books. And then lastly, it's the space and the environment, much of which is a sensorial experience. So the smells, as you mentioned, it's actually the glues mostly, and paper and ink that over time decay and give off these volatile organic compounds that create the smell that we either love or some people have a distaste for. But it's also just the visual of walking into a space and being what one writer called book wrapped, feeling like you're blanketed in books. And
I
it's a
know that feeling.
tremendous,
I mean, you feel smart in the bookstore for some reason, even though you haven't read a page yet when you got there.
it's inspiring. And there are other spaces that can do similar things. I used to live in New York City, and I told people, walk into the New York Public Library main branch on 42nd
Yeah,
Street.
yeah.
You can't not walk in there and feel curious or like you want to be a scholar. And
Is
there's
it
a
because
similar,
is it because we like feeling proximate to people who have explored, and the same thing as walking into the Space Museum or something like that?
I think it's partly the people that we're surrounded by in the space, and they give us the sense, maybe just by being there, that they're curious or learned kinds of people, and the books themselves that are portals to stories, which is, one of the kind of most base human pleasures is telling a story or hearing a story. There are seemingly infinite answers in these books to all sorts of questions,
Mhm.
and just pathways to knowledge that excite us in this moment before we get back to the kind of drudgery of our regular and much more pedestrian experience.
How do we let's fill in the next 200 years, or at least part of them right now. How do we start to see the business bloom from Ben Franklin and then on to the next era of bookstores as people get at least a little bit better at acquiring books in greater quantities to distribute?
So some as the market changes, there's a flourishing of American literature and authors. And I profile one bookstore in Boston called the Old Corner, which was a publishing center and also a bookstore. And it published, Nathaniel Hawthorne and Longfellow and Holmes and all these other great authors. But it not just published those books, it was a place where these guys hung out. And so it was this great kind of nexus of literary capital, both a place where these ideas were disseminated through the publishing house across the states, but was also representative of a new typology of bookstore, one in which people came to commune and gather and hang out. So Ben Franklin's bookstore was small, it was loud, it was noisy, it was stinky. But by the time we get to the 1830s and 40s, we have bookstores that are meant to be browsable and invite people to not just come and get a book, but to stay and talk.
Did um, at what point do we start to get best-selling authors? Was it a regional thing, and how are people able to figure out that if I can get these things mass produced, there's more than just one person out there who's going to want to listen to what I have to say?
Yeah, so that's actually an interesting question because there are books that sell exceptionally well fairly early on. The most famous is probably Thomas Paine's Common Sense, which is more of a pamphlet than a book, but it's really the first kind of American bestseller that's being spread across the then colonies about to be United States and being sold in bookstores and read on the streets. The kind of concept of a bestseller doesn't actually emerge until the 20th century. So the famous New York Times list doesn't appear. It appears in a kind of local list of what people are reading. But an idea of a national bestseller, sort of ideology, doesn't come into formation really until the 1940s. And that has its own transformational effect on the business, but also bookstores, some of which that begin to cater to these books because there's this new sense, not that there weren't books that sold exceptionally well, but this was a kind of new idea of American culture that to be cultured, you needed to read what was selling well everywhere else. And bookstores, most notably the chain stores that emerged more so in the 80s and 90s, were selling not exclusively, but predominantly bestsellers.
And early on, at what point do bookstores start to grow and expand? In other words, was there one bookstore in each town, or does each town or city start to have two, three, and four of them based on subject or based on type of book?
If you're looking for a political podcast that goes beyond the headlines, check out the Beltway Briefing. I'm Howard Schweitzer, CEO of Cozen O'Connor Public Strategies. Every week on the Beltway Briefing, our team of former Republican and Democratic presidential appointees, Capitol Hill veterans, and political advocates shares behind-the-scenes perspective that cuts through the noise. If you want the inside scoop, subscribe now to the Beltway Briefing here or wherever you get your podcasts.
So they were fairly small and specialized in the earliest years. And Philadelphia, after Ben Franklin, had a couple of other printers, some of whom would sell books. And they kind of mushroomed. In the book, I write a sort of a brief bit about the landscape sort of at the turn of the Civil War, because there was this great essentially book selling census done, a snapshot of 1860 booksellers. And that was really interesting to see. And most big cities had a handful of booksellers, at least by then. Even small towns often had two or three. They did congregate in more urban areas and more affluent areas as they do today. And there were many more bookstores in New York and Boston and elsewhere, not just total number, but even per capita. So they did congregate in these kind of literary centers. And in the South, that meant Charleston and New Orleans, for example.
And were they importing books, or were they coming in from other domestic spaces?
So they were, from the earliest years, largely importing. By the 1860s, there were enough American printers that most of the stock was coming internally, but the publishers were all in the Northeast, which also made book selling easier in the Northeast because it was cheaper and quicker to get the books.
Yeah, like imagine how much it would cost to ship a book from England in the, in the 1700s and
Yeah.
1800s. It's
And
unbelievable.
imagine what it's like to be a Confederate bookseller in 1862 when all of your books are either coming from England or the North, which you're at war with. So,
Interesting. All right, we have to talk about the elephant in the room here is Barnes and Noble. How did they get started?
so it's actually a very old company, and it was a combination of two different booksellers and publishers. And then they became a kind of known for selling college textbooks. But it really wasn't until a guy named Len Riggio bought it in the early 1980s, I believe. And he was a graduate, he was a student undergrad at NYU and was working in the bookstore. And he just really became a reader at that point in his life. And he talked to the manager of the bookstore, and he began to be thinking about his own neighborhood. He grew up in Bensonhurst, Brooklyn, this Italian American working class neighborhood. And he had found most of the bookstores off-putting and thought that most of his friends growing up didn't ever go to bookstores. They were seen as elitist, smug kind of spaces. So he had the idea of, and he used largely borrowed money to take this great investment in Barnes and Noble, which again was not a nationally known bookseller yet. But his idea was to sort of blow this up and make it a giant bookstore that would be inviting to everyone, democratic space. And that's what he did. He started running television commercials, which people thought was insane for a bookstore to sort of, consort with the enemy, television. Um, and he just started building stores, created the superstore model, the idea of these giant places where there wasn't pressure to buy. There were couches and tables, and chairs and Starbucks eventually. And they were really just going to be hangout spaces. So he created this brand and took Barnes and Noble again from a small regional bookstore to the power player that it was and is, as really the only major chain still standing. Books a
And
Million exists, but
how many bookstore chains are there? I mean, you mentioned Books a Million. There was Borders for a while, but they really fizzled out.
yeah, so Barnes and Noble is really the most powerful one standing. Its biggest rival was Borders, and they were the two juggernauts. And they had competition in the early days with Crown and Walden Books and other booksellers that those two companies typically bought out. So they just kept getting bigger through acquisition and building their own stores and crowded out the market. And Barnes and Noble, I spoke with Len before he died a few months ago for the book. I interviewed him a couple of years ago, and he was very generous to give me this interview because he's often portrayed as a villain, the killer of indie bookstores, and doesn't like to talk to people about it. But he thought I was somebody else, I think, and a friend of a friend granted me this interview. But I spent an afternoon with him, and the way he saw his legacy was that Barnes and Noble became the dominant chain, and that today it's the one left standing. But it didn't actually kill off the independents; it just killed off Borders. At least that's the way that he framed it.
All right, I want to ask you about how you put this book together. First of all, I got to ask, whose idea was it to put the little chapter um, bookmarks at the beginning of each chapter? Who came up with that? But it's a brilliant little idea.
Yeah, that's the book designer. So, for better or worse, authors typically have no real role in the cover design or the design, the typeface that's selected and the little kind of features. But I got very lucky because I think it's a handsome book.
It really is. I opened up the book and I saw that little bookmark at the beginning of each chapter, and I was like, "Oh, look at that! What a great idea!" And as far as um, the cover illustration, is that an illustration or is that a photo of a particular place?
It's derived from a photo of a particular bookstore, and then it has all these, digital layers on top of it. So it's some kind of combination of real and imagined.
It's really awesome. It's beautiful. All right, so I want to ask, what were your sources for this book? How do you piece together where bookstores are? There's probably not one archive that covers this. So how did you put this all together?
It was hard to figure out which bookstores to highlight. And a lot of that was based on which stores or booksellers had surviving papers. So Ben Franklin, thankfully, wrote his own autobiography. And because he was so famous in his lifetime, there's lots of letters that he wrote and letters that people wrote to him that still exist. The more modern stores, it was complicated. I did research at archives and libraries in New York, California, Chicago, North Carolina, Texas, basically all over the country, digging through archives. And a lot of it is really tiresome work. Or, you see some bookstore and they have the receipts from the inventory, and it's at first fascinating, like, oh, I'm going to be able to write some kind of portrait of what the stock was like of this bookstore in 1968. But then you just see thousands and thousands and thousands of pages of this material. You're like,
You're like, oh,
well,
great.
I don't know how this is really does the reader really care
Right.
for me to sort of reconstitute the shelves of some bookstore at a given time? So there's a lot of transactional material, receipts, credit card inventories and material. So one of the challenges is to suss out what's significant and how to tell a story without hitting the reader. I mean, my goal was really for the book to be deeply researched, but to wear that research lightly so that it still reads like a,
It's really
entertaining
nicely written. It's
narrative.
it's really great. How did is this the first attempt at a book like this?
So I was shocked when I pitched this book, or I had the idea for the book. I assumed that it already existed because who wouldn't what writer wouldn't have thought about writing about bookstores? And there are lots of material about the history of books, at least from academic historians, a whole fields and of book history that focuses much more on the book itself than the spaces that sold them. And there is academic literature, and I don't mean to suggest that every idea in the book is my own. There are tons and tons of endnotes tucked away in the back from scholars that I learned a lot about. But this is really the first comprehensive history of the bookshop.
You've written a couple of books about bicycles. How did bicycles lead you to books? Is there a common path there?
Yeah, the common path is me. And so historians, at least us, with PhDs who are trained in methodology, the suggestion is that we're supposed to be kind of distant scholars from our sources, and dispassionate is maybe a way to objectivity and truth. But my interest in bicycles started from a very personal interest. I was living in New York City in graduate school, riding around town on my bicycle and wondering why the environment was so inhospitable. I know that there are other places in the world and other times in which bicycles were flourishing. So, what were the kind of historical choices that led to all these decisions that we're making? And I had a similar impulse with regards to books and bookstores. My girlfriend worked at a small independent bookstore in New York. And it was really through her experience that I saw the power that these spaces can have, both behind the counter and as a consumer. And I had lived through in my own years this great decline in the number of bookstores. And so wanted to know why there weren't more. And essentially, this came from a very selfish place from my own mind of thinking that wouldn't it be great if the world in our country and our states and our cities and our neighborhoods were filled with bicycles and bookstores.
Hmm. I would love that. That sounds great, right? It sounds great to probably everybody, but
Yeah.
it's the implementing that's
Right.
difficult.
But so the questions of the book are basically like, why isn't that the case?
Yeah.
Why aren't, yeah.
Um, there's a point at which books start to not just be bought new, but they begin to be bought used. And it just seems like the prototype for that is the Strand bookstore in New York. If you've never been there, it's worth literally a trip to New York just to go to the Strand. I go there almost every time I'm back in town. New York is where I'm from. It's an unbelievable place. How or at least who realized that you could make books a second, third, fourth, and fifth and 10th purchase, or purchase them 10 times around?
Yeah. So the secondhand market didn't really develop until there were enough books floating around the early American states. And there were from fairly early on some small used booksellers. Many times they were kind of itinerant and would go from one state to another hawking books, or would tote along giant carts of used books. And then the Strand emanated from Fourth Avenue, this place called Book Row in New York City, that around the turn of the 20th century, these are very small, a line of small used bookstores, most of which had different specialties. And so part of the appeal was that they were used and affordable, although there were also high end antiquarian shops too. But many of the used books provided relatively easy access to books because they were cheaper, but they were also highly specialized. Like somebody would just amass all of these old used books related to geology, or books that were mysteries, or books that were in Russian, for which there wasn't a huge market new. So it was just a kind of combination of all these, German language books, Russian language books, books about science, books about archaeology, maps, etc. And then, for a variety of reasons, many of these shops started to go out of business. And essentially, the Strand became the one to survive. And essentially a conglomeration of all of them. It became probably larger than, the 20 or 30 shops that there were on that block. And the Strand had been one of them.
It's
And it's
such an
not just the
amazing
last
story.
one standing. Yeah, it's a remarkable institution. And it moved just a couple of blocks off of the row.
Mm. Uh, how are books marketed today versus when the books were at their peak? You go into Barnes and Noble and they have so many other little offerings. I mean, even the Strand has like an accessory line. How do they get you coming back in?
So there have always been sidelines. That's what booksellers called non-book merchandise. And as I mentioned, Ben Franklin was selling chocolate and sort of other kinds of goods. So that's waned and waxed in terms of its importance. And most booksellers make a higher profit margin on the tote bags and merch than they do on the books. So some of the challenges of the book industry is that the profit margins are just relatively low, and there's no way to really do anything about that because the publishers control the prices of the book, and a bookseller can only sell the book for what it says, which is usually printed on the book itself in the flap. So there are all those kind of constraints. But, in marketing, one of the challenges Franklin had is that there weren't that many readers. One of the challenges today is that there's millions of titles being issued every year, and it's so noisy, the market, that any individual author has to clear so many hurdles to have their book found at a Barnes and Noble by getting an agent, by getting an editor to publish it, by getting enough media attention that Barnes and Noble or some other store thinks that they're going to be able to sell it, by the buyers there thinking that the book is good enough, and then giving it a home on a shelf, which is, valuable and costs money. So you might walk into Barnes and Noble and think that this place is full of books, but it's a tiny, tiny, tiny
Right.
fraction of the number of books that exist out in the world.
Right, right. All right. So the second elephant in the room, the first elephant is Barnes and Noble. The second elephant in the room is Amazon. And it just seems so underwhelming that they started selling books because they were A, easy to ship. They're not going to get damaged. And B, they could be cataloged easy. It was an easy thing for them to move early on. Oh, does it qualify going into a bookstore just by clicking Amazon.com? Have I visited a bookshop?
I don't think so.
I
It's
don't think
funny.
so
I
either. Yeah.
I teach
Talk
it.
about sidelines, right? They have tens of thousands of sidelines.
Well, yeah, so many sidelines
They're
that
only
people
sidelines.
people who were 20 years old, my students here at James Madison University, many of them don't even know that Amazon started with books because to their world it's just an everything store, a superstore, and the books are a tiny, or often to them an invisible part of Amazon. It's not like if you just go to
Yeah, there's
amazon.com.
no books there. Yeah. Yeah.
So that's a kind of
The crazy thing is I remember the first time it happened. Like I remember like hearing about Amazon and I had to go on to buy, I think, a text, and you can actually go back and see your first purchases. I should have done that, but I think in 97 or 98 I bought a book for like an AP history course, and I remember going on there and being like, it's just going to show up. How is it going to
yeah.
show up? Who has the book right now?
Yeah, and Bezos always imagined that it was going to be more like it is today than a bookseller. And so as you pointed out, books were the kind of easiest product to start with because they're easy to get in terms of from other distributors. And to the point we were talking about earlier in terms of how many books are actually in the bookstore, even the superstores, Barnes and Nobles, were carrying a small percentage of the books, not necessarily your textbook that you were looking for. So there was a kind of um, a space for a place that was supposedly going to have every book imaginable, and it would be easy, and it was, and it became so successful so quickly that more so than Barnes and Noble transformed the market and seemed to pre an existential threat, and is, to brick and mortar bookselling. And one of the ironies is that now Barnes and Noble, which had been seen as a sort of warring entity to the indie bookstores, now Barnes and Noble and indie bookstores often see themselves as
They're
allies.
in league now. Yeah, right. Yeah, the enemy of my enemy is my friend. Um,
Exactly.
when it comes to the future of these independent bookstores, there are still a good number of them. There's a couple in Tampa. I mean, one closed pretty recently, but There's a few here, and there's, you go into towns and there are independent bookstores, particularly they're in New York, there's some in Boston. Um, what does the future hold for them?
Well, I always like to give a disclaimer that I'm a historian and not a
Yeah, there
futurist,
you
and that
go. That's an easy way out.
yeah, well, anyone predicting the future doesn't know what they're talking
Yeah,
about.
exactly
So it's
right.
good to just put that out there and say
Yeah.
that, unlike somebody who's hawking you, some stock picking solution or something
Yeah.
like that. But I will say, and apropos of Barnes and Noble opening 60 stores, I was just in South Florida at the Miami Book Fair,
Mm.
where Mitch Kaplan has created a handful of books and books, these independent bookstores that seem to be flourishing and very successful. So I think that there are seeds and signs of growth. And I'm hopeful that there's an appreciation, a growing appreciation for these in real life, in person experiences, these tactile experiences that are about atmosphere. And I know, anecdotally, most human beings hate their cell phone, hate the fact that they spend so much time on a screen, wish that they read more, idealized local businesses. So I think the elements are all in play, and it's just a question of how motivated we are to make the choices with our feet and with our credit cards and with our time to actually go and support our local bookstores.
Yeah. Someone on our show who did a book about books, she explored books, what makes a book. She was on a couple years ago. She said that this is more of a theory question. She said, books are really not as sentimental as they seem. We all say we love them, but then they all get thrown. And now, listen, I'm a hoarder. Okay. I've got hundreds of books here, and I'm a book hoarder. And I'm an organized book lover, and I love having them, and I love seeing my neat little stacks, and each one is like a little mini trophy to me, to use a Seinfeld phrase. But they all get thrown out one day. Even mine will one day, sadly. Most of them get, maybe not by me though, but most of them get traded and donated until they're in the recycle bin. Do you agree with that? That the books themselves don't become sentimental?
No, I disagree entirely
Interesting.
because they do eventually get thrown away and they get passed around so much because nobody wants to be the one throwing them away. You're not the only one.
Right, right.
Throwing a book in the trash feels like sacrilegious in a way, like it's icky. And booksellers, one of the most uncomfortable things for a new bookseller to learn is that sometimes the books have to be ripped up essentially, because especially if it's like a cheap paperback, it comes into your bookstore damaged. You tell the publisher, they give you a credit, but it's worth so little that they don't want to pay for you to ship it back. So they say donate or destroy. And donating can be difficult if it's a damaged book. And sometimes the libraries and the Goodwills are just overwhelmed. And so there's this new bookseller on her first day of work who's told, go in the back and destroy, these 12 paperback books. And let me tell you, that's a hard thing to do
Yeah, right.
for people because these are near holy objects. All of us have had special books in our lives. And no, I think they are special objects. People buy them for decor. People like being surrounded by them. I think they are powerful spiritual objects.
You dedicated this book to Amanda, your favorite bookseller. Who's Amanda, and why did you dedicate it to her?
So Amanda's my wife,
I
who
figured. I figured.
is the one who got me started into this world because she was a bookseller while I was studying history. And it was really through her experience that I came to appreciate that the bookstores were not just these transactional spaces, but that there were customers who came every day to just hang out and talk and realize the kind of, specialness to them. And she's recently gotten back into the game of book selling here in our town of Harrisonburg, Virginia. And she opened a small indie bookstore called Parentheses.
Hmm. What's she's back in the game. I love it. What's next for you? Do you think you'll do another product? Is there a product out there? Is there a clear line that bicycles
Um,
to books? And then what would
something
be
that
next?
starts with a B. I
Yeah,
don't
right.
know. I have a bunch of ideas and not to be too sort of I don't know, philosophical about it, but I would just say this, I've written three books, but only this is my first if you count books that lots of people have read
That
or
anyone else has
that
read
are
but you.
so I'm very grateful that people have taken to this book and that's afforded a lot of great opportunities, but also some pressures about how to follow up and what to do. And so I'm trying to navigate that and plot a way forward.
Awesome. Evan Friss, the author of The Bookshop, A History of the American Bookstore. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you.
Check out the book and his website, evanfriss.com. He's on the website formerly known as Twitter at Evan Friss. I want to invite listeners to our Patreon page to ask for your support in keeping this show going. Go to patreon.com/AxelBankHistory. We will donate a part of your contributions to a charity for children's literacy. And thank you for listening to Axelbank Reports History and Today, conversations with America's top nonfiction authors and why their books matter right now. Check us out on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram at Axelbank History. We update those with clips from the show, guest announcements, and book recommendations. See you next time. Thanks.